Hello and welcome to another episode of our show 28.4 FM, connecting India's youth to the world. We're excited to begin our new conversation series, and it's on a topic that is very relevant, timely, and important to me and hopefully to all of you. We're going to be talking about freedom of expression in India. And this has taken precedence in the last few months because of all the high profile sort of cases in the Supreme Court, in various levels of the judiciary, as they relate to activists around the country who have been imprisoned for their activism. And I think it's now time to reevaluate how much power we are giving our government and indeed the courts in terms of regulating speech in the country. So because this topic is very nuanced, we have with us a lawyer, Abhinav Sekhri, who is a criminal lawyer practicing in the courts of Delhi. His primary interests are criminal law and procedure, and he has done his LLB from the National Law School in Bangalore, as well as a graduate degree from the Harvard Law School. Abhinav, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
So let me start off at a high level. To what extent would you consider speech free in India, and how has this changed in the last sort of few months? And let's just talk about, since 2014, since this new government took power.
So on the first issue of how free is speech, I'd say it's as free as the government feels like it, until someone who has the wherewithal to go to a court decides to go to the court and challenge what the government does. So that's one. And I really mean that. And I hope that over the course of our conversation, I'll be able to explain just how. And the second is, so I don't think that, yes, there would have been a downslide since 2014, but I'd say that, frankly, it's part of what has happened since 1950 itself, since the choices that we made at the start. It's there since the start. It's obviously, you can see that there are troughs and there are peaks, right? So right now it seems that as a democracy itself, there are various challenges that we are facing, definitely, and some challenges much more gravely than others, such as what about the idea of questioning what is a national project. So earlier also you would have questions about the national project. There have always been questions about a national project. It's integral to, an idea of a country, probably, especially a young one like us. But right now it's just, there are very few qualms about putting people in line, so to speak. So I'd say that the recipe has always been there. It's just about how far you decide to go. So it's always been a question of benevolence, not really a question of the legal fabric as such.
Definitely. And India's history of free speech is, of course, a very checkered one. And we often forget that it was the first government of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, which was actually the Constituent Assembly sitting at the provisional parliament that allowed government-wide powers to restrict free speech. Now, constitutional lawyers and students would, of course, know that as Article 19(2). So how did we come here? What, in your view, has been the historical attitude of the lower courts surrounding freedom of expression? Because there is a growing perception that speech is less free today than at any point in the recent past. So how did we get ourselves here?
So let's unpack that, because I think that there are three different points in what you said, Sanskriti. So, the first one would be just the history part of it, because I think that's really fascinating. And there's been more writing about it in the last 4 years than what might have been in the last 40. Essentially, since you had what is Granville Austin writing his books about the Constituent Assembly's debates. So, recently there's been a book called 16 Stormy Days that only focuses on the First Amendment to the Constitution and puts forth the idea that, look, the government was responsible for bringing us to where we are today. That's certainly an argument, but I don't necessarily agree with all of it. I'd rather go somewhere in the middle, where the idea of restrictions was something that we agreed to at the start of the Constituent Assembly. And frankly, they were worse. And I'll tell you why, at least why I think they were worse. So if you look at the unamended sort of version of Article 19(1)(a), it basically says that the government can pass law, and there are certain categories that are outlined. So security of the state, I'm a bit hazy on the language, and I actually had it open in a tab because I knew that this is going to go here. So you have specific categories that are outlined. what happens with the First Amendment is there are two separate things that happen. One definite, in my view, bad thing is that set of categories is broadened to include very vague, nebulous, frankly, horrible things such as public order. So it now says you can restrict fees, you can pass laws that take away your right for things such as maintaining public order. Now that's one part. The second part is it's not only saying that you can pass laws that take away these rights. So it's actually toned down the absolutism in a way, because what 19(2) today says is that you can pass laws that contain reasonable restrictions to these rights. Now that is a change in a way that it actually improves upon what was there earlier, because what you have now is that you have this idea of reasonableness that comes in, that essentially means that you can't simply say, okay, you can't talk about security of the state. You can't talk about matters that the government thinks affect the security of the state. The government can pass a law, but that law has to withstand scrutiny. Now, who decides that it withstands scrutiny? And that comes to your part about the courts, right? So ultimately then reasonable restrictions is how the Constitution decided, okay, I will allow courts to go ahead and exercise some form of scrutiny on what the government's doing. Now, is it a good measure? So I honestly think that what we have now as a model in India, and that links back to the first answer about what's the scope of free speech, is actually this. The government can frankly still pass any law that it thinks is fine as far as the restrictions on speech are concerned, because there is what is called a presumption of legality. So whatever law is passed, it's presumed that it's good law, right? Unless someone goes to court challenging it. And now the Constitution does tell you that, okay, a court has to decide if it's reasonable. But reasonableness is again vague, right? That's one. And two, courts take time. And something that's happened in the last sort of, I would say over the decade actually, but obviously it's become much more pronounced over the last 5 years with the amount of just data that we have, that the most important court as far as, deciding issues of freedom of speech is concerned just takes so much more time to decide them, and sometimes just does not decide them, right? So if your legal framework is government, you pass law, and after that the court can come in if someone goes to the court, and if the court just decides not to do anything about it, then in effect you've gone back to a system where the government can do anything it wants. And that's a problem, because every day that goes by, right? Every day that would have gone by, suppose, where now the Kerala government withdrew its ordinance. But imagine every day that it would have gone by with having the ordinance that allowed police to arrest people for objectionable media posts online and elsewhere. Even though I would argue as a lawyer that that was clearly unconstitutional, that would still allow day after day after day for people to be arrested. Who's going to go back and, are we going to give them damages for the unlawful custody that they suffer? Of course not. That's not going to happen. So these are the costs that we have in the model, of law that India still subscribes to. And the costs are becoming bigger with the courts taking much longer to decide these issues.
So I want to drive this point in a way that's a little less abstract and more, tangible. So a lot of people around me will say, okay, you're amongst the few people who will obsess about free speech and how important it is, but how does it affect the average person's life? And I'd like you to give me like a good answer that I can give to them, that why should an average citizen of the country care about free speech?
So I'll tell you why. Because the way the law is right now is that if you post anything online, right? Anything, and I mean literally anything, posted online, write about it. Today, it is lawful if some police officer thinks that whatever you wrote was objectionable. I mean, the language is not going to be objectionable per se, but they're going to figure out something. There's some problem with it. It's obscene, right? Or shudder, it's seditious, right? Who decides it at the ground level is a police officer, right? For me to say that no, my speech was not seditious, I can't fight that fight at that level.
No, you're
So literally whatever I write, I at some level have to censor myself in my brain that, oh, don't write this, because some police or some, even not even police, right? Some random person might file a complaint against me in some random corner of the country, random for me because I live in a certain part and that part is random for me. And then I have to be at the mercy of legal proceedings anywhere. That's why our free speech is not really free, because if I have to literally keep thinking about that each time, and obviously if I'm someone who engages with politics, who engages with the choices that the state makes, that cost is obviously bigger. It's not going to be a cost that ordinary people will face. That's fine, but that's not the point. The point is that who has to make those fights, right? Because someone does have to. And why should the cost be so high for them to say literally basic things such as, oh, this is stupid policy? And it's not fair. It's not fair. I mean, as an abstract, it's not fair even if you imagine any society. The costs can't be so high to speak your mind.
Definitely. And on that point, I would like to move on to a subject that is certainly very critical when we talk about free speech, which is hate speech, as you rightly mentioned, in terms of sedition, contempt of court. Now, hate speech is, of course, an area that is widely accepted as requiring some form of prohibition, that is speech that incites violence. As in the American Constitution, it's called the Fighting Words Doctrine. India, of course, has a criminal law that makes hate speech, that is speech that spreads hates towards a particular religion, caste, or community, an offense that can land someone in jail for 3 years now. Abhinav, do you see section 153A of the IPC or even section 124, that is sedition, of course? Do you think it is reasonable restriction on free speech? Or on the other hand, do you think it is good enough, or do we need more provisions to prevent hate speech?
So, I mean, as a lawyer, I'd say that, this is something that the Supreme Court was asked to think about in a decision called Pravasi Bharatiya Sangathan. So there, I mean, the issue was literally just this, and the courts were asked to decide upon it. Supreme Court said, look, our existing framework is fine. So you have all these laws that regulate hate speech and offensive speech, and we think that it's fine. I mean, I think the answer is that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And if you were to look around you as to what's happening, I think the answer is a bit obvious as to what is what is enough, what is not enough. But let's go beyond that, right? Because I believe I'm here to provide the nuance as it is. So I think it again boils down to a big question about enforcement. And I think hate speech globally, and I don't think it's only India right now, right? But I think hate speech on social media platforms, not only platforms, but also close-knit social media, where you don't have a platform as such, but you have invite-only groups which are spewing hate speech. I mean, sometimes that's literally all that you get, or WhatsApp groups for that matter. So, I mean, there are difficult questions about regulating. How far do you go? What are the obligations of private players in this field? Because ultimately, I have to try and tone down the abstraction, but there is one issue of what do you call hate speech? And I think you can maybe do a little bit better as far as Indian law is concerned to broaden it further, and, definitely. But I think that's actually a smaller part of the problem, because the other parts are where it happens and who is there to regulate it. And I think that you can't just change the law to fix those problems. It's much deeper. And I think that what we're seeing globally is proof that, this problem is something that probably is going to contain a lot of rights activists as well as lawmakers over the next 5 to 6 years.
So when I think about civil liberties and free speech, I'm not a lawyer, but it's common sense that you would think of the judicial branch as a check and balance on excessive legislative overreach in this domain. But, correct me if my impression is wrong, but over the past several weeks and months, I have seen instances where the court hasn't shown that level of deference for free speech in its own right, and in its own wisdom has chosen to request or initiate contempt proceedings in various instances. To what extent is this trend sort of ahistorical and unique to the past few years? And is this something that concerns you as an officer of the court?
No, so again, I divide that across two questions. So one is the role of the judiciary as checks and balances, and the court not doing enough, and then the contempt bit, because I think it's separate enough for it to require conversation in and of itself. About the court not doing enough. So like I said, you're absolutely right in how you see the court in terms of serving as a check and balance, because literally that's what the First Amendment did. It made it very clear that the court is going to serve as a check, because when the Constitution says that there are reasonable restrictions, and it also says that courts are the ones who will put a stamp of legality that yes, these restrictions are reasonable in this case. Now, if you have a setup where the courts just don't do that quickly enough, or frankly, even often enough, I'm fine if you pass a decision that, says, okay, I think it's reasonable. Today, we move to a space, like you said, where courts just aren't deciding those issues. Or on an average, that issue will take over a year to decide while the law is still in force. So it's definitely a problem, right? So, and I'm saying, let's not even get to how the court decides things, because I think that's too technical and maybe beyond what we want to talk about. And there are issues with that. But I'm saying just, decide things. And there are ways in which, as a court, or I'm not only saying the Supreme Court, but even high courts where these issues come first, why don't we have slowly a setup where even these matters that are challenging the legality of statutes, let's decide them expeditiously. Let's put them on a fast track of sorts so that everyone has clarity going forward. But in a setup where right now habeas corpus type petitions where people get arbitrarily picked up, those petitions are not decided for years in some cases. What else is going to happen, right? So courts definitely are not doing enough. You're absolutely right in that perception. And that there's a clear link in the idea that, how free is my speech? Because if you have a setup where the courts are seen to be doing enough, even that much, I'm sure that any government, state or center, is going to think twice about it. If you have a setup where courts are seemingly, okay, fine, I'll look at it when I feel like it. If that's the perception that the society gets at large, obviously your freedom of speech is going to feel threatened. Coming to contempt, now that's that's something totally different altogether. Now, different altogether in terms of one, why do we need a law of contempt? And two, how culpable or how responsible is the court? I honestly don't have a good enough answer on the second one, because what happens is that in the technical scheme of things, so like a lot of people would have seen, the law officer, the foremost law officer of the country, the Attorney General, Correct, is required to give consent unless the court itself starts contempt proceedings. So we've seen two very prominent instances of both, right? So in the case of one certain individual, the court itself started contempt proceedings.
Right.
And then there was a 1 rupee fine and all that. So that's the example that I'm talking about. And then obviously you have examples where the Attorney General gives consent for the contempt proceedings to start. So I'd say that on the latter, I'm not going to go into what the court is going to do or what it's not going to do. But on the former, definitely, even then you have a clear idea that a court is still very concerned about its public perception. And I personally think that it does not make sense.
The court should set an example, right? Like
Exactly.
in terms of deference for free speech.
Yeah.
That was the point. Maybe I wasn't making clearly enough, that if the direction from the top, yeah.
No, and you know what? It's really fascinating. And all I can do is maybe just point you guys and listeners to, just see the kind of public utterances by judges in the last 2 to 3 years, and judges at various levels,
Right.
while they're sitting on the bench and even privately when they're giving speeches. So I remember very clearly there were certain judges during when this contempt stuff was hot on the press. It was something that was making daily headlines. I remember, I don't remember the name of the judge, but I remember someone went ahead in the public and said, as judges, we have to just sit there and we have to listen to all sorts of stuff that gets said about us. And how is that fair? There should be some restraint in commentary about what we do and how we do it. And in my head, I'm like, hold on, why? You're a public office. People are allowed to disagree with how you go about doing what you do. I know that judges are not elected officials. Everyone knows that, but they're certainly not exempt from scrutiny simply because they're judges. And I think at some level, it's not judges, lawyers, they're not very clear about what's the balance. There's certainly a balance. Nobody should be subjected to the vilest forms of speech that we know people can go. Obviously, people can go that far, but to say that, it's a problem if people are talking about our role as judges and how we go about it, I mean, isn't that a bit too far? For instance, passing gag orders whenever you feel, I mean, isn't that just a bit too far? That's what I thought. I mean, definitely the leading, for example, part is unstated. Obviously, courts have to serve as an example. But I mean, I was very piqued by curiosity about, how, even though they're sitting on the bench, and I've written about this in a different context. So I've written about it in the context of criminal law and, this idea that if you look at the past 20 years of sorts, and if you go before that, before the era of the PIL, so to speak, courts really didn't occupy a public space in India. I mean, if you look at the headlines, courts did form headlines, right? Judicial decisions. So I've done a lot of archival work for my thesis way back in law school. So if you look at judicial decisions, I looked at the Times of India's archives. You had decisions that were front page news. They were, because, court decisions of the Supreme Court were considered to be really important. There would be criticism. There would be decisions that are, not liked by the press and editorials. But that was there. But since, this PIL era, when the court actively steps into governance, you are actively stepping into governance. You are openly admitting that you are stepping into governance, and you're very happy about it. And people are very happy about it. But when people are not happy about it, for instance, when a court says, okay, let's do free testing, and then changes its mind and says, okay, let's not do free testing for COVID. I mean, people are entitled to not feel happy about it, and talk about not being happy about it.
I think we can have a whole different conversation on judicial activism over the last decade in India,
And it's linked to this idea of contempt, right? Because I think that the court actively set itself up for a space of more public scrutiny the more it got into governance. And I think that at some level, it reflects certain judicial attitudes, public attitudes, and lawyer attitudes, all of us, because even the bar associations, jump to the defense of judges. Right? I'm a member of bar associations.
Right.
So I know what I don't know all that happens there, but I know a lot that happens there, because ultimately this is a professional community that thinks that its members are being attacked. And I think that underlying that, we're just not very clear about public engagement, what's criticism, what's not criticism. All criticism is not an attack on you. It's an attack on your decisions. There's a difference. And I think that those lines are still not very clear in public discourse. And that, I mean, when it's the court and with all power at its disposal, it sends a signal, and it's not a good one.
Definitely. And that reminds me of a judgment by Justice O.C. Reddy. Then 1987, the Jehovah's Witnesses, wherein he protected the rights of the community not standing up for the national anthem. Which brings me to something of what is patriotism in forms of, now we have this really stringent act in place, that is the UAPA. Now, not a lot of people knew about the UAPA until the 2019 amendment. Now let's make this clear, right? The UAPA was drafted in 1967 by the Indira Gandhi government because of the secessionist tendency of the DMK and Nagaland and Assam, right? Then we had 2004 amendment, 2008 amendment, and it's not like we did not have the UAPA Act in forms of the the TADA Act, which had this provision, if you remember, Section 3C, which are the same provisions, bail provisions, as the UAPA Act. What makes the UAPA Act different? Is it the time it was drafted? Is it because the abrogation, citizenship? What is with the UAPA? Like, why can't we understand? Like, I'm just frustrated at this point.
You're frustrated. I mean, I can sense that. So I think I'm actually guilty of sort of becoming this person who talks a lot about the UAPA, but I mean, I sort of set myself up there. Like I said, the court has set itself up. So you're right when you said that the UAPA set up, and again, I think what you said was that we can do separate episodes of stuff. I think the UAPA can be an entire separate episode for you
I
guys
agree.
going forward.
I just want to point out that Abhinav has written a really good article in the Caravan, which we link in the episode description. I think it's worth reading to give his full thoughts on why he thinks the latest amendment is problematic. Having said that, let me hand it over back to him.
Yes.
So that's very kind of you. But so on the UAPA, right? So just I'm going to go on a little bit of a long monologue or discursive monologue of sorts, which might digress from the point. But so it's historically like Samskruti said, it's 1967 and it's not 2020 as some people think. It's not right now. It's been here for a while. But from 1967 till 2004, it was a very different kind of law. It came in to deal with, like she said, secessionist tendencies. That's in itself curious because the law actually was first mooted 4.5 years before it got passed. And by the time it was actually passed, those secessionist tendencies had all but waned. They were actually, so there was a committee that was set up in 1963 that recommended doing this law. You had wars in the middle and you had the war with China. The secessionist tendencies start just around the end of the Indo-Chinese war. And they are out by the time, let's say, the Indo-Pakistan war happens in 1965. You have the UAPA in 1967. And so there are interesting debates there about, its birth itself. And the UAPA in its first sort of 1967 to 2004 role was actually this really anti-free speech law. And I'd say it was one of those predominant anti-free speech laws and not anti-liberty law as, today what it's becoming. Because what the UAPA did was it prevented anyone from talking about anything as far as India's territorial boundaries are concerned. You could just not talk about wanting to set up a different state, wanting to maybe leave the country. Not allowed. And what was criminalized was talking about it publicly. Right? So the first prominent attacks on the UAPA in parliament, as it were actually free speech attacks. Like, it's just totally ridding away our notions of what is political debate. And the government managed to get this law through. But if you look at its enforcement, it's not something that got used very often, maybe because conversations about leaving the country or what is the state of satisfaction with the union sort of dipped in intensity as well. Sort of, but not entirely. Then you have 2004 to 2020, which is where we are today. And why the UAPA is something that, is different now from what it was before is because today it serves this really important function for the governments, plural, is that it's like the only anti-terror law that's there, right?
So it replaces TADA.
So TADA was replaced earlier itself. So TADA actually died a natural death, so to speak, after taking a lot of lives and ruining a lot of lives. TADA decided to die a natural death sometime in 1996. We had this period between that and what is called the Prevention of Terrorism Act.
Correct.
Which did not have a real anti-terror law, so to speak. And so at that time, you had very high profile terrorist incidents. So you had a purported attack, and I mean, what am I saying? Purported, whatever. There's a Supreme Court decision affirming the conviction. So there was a Red Fort case, which a lot of people don't remember because it wasn't as high profile as what happened later, which was the Parliament attack.
Parliament
case.
attack.
And Parliament attack was just around the time that you had the new ordinance and the new act, and then that also went by 2004. That's when you had the amendments done to the UAPA. Now, where I think the UAPA is different, and it's closer to TADA, but it's still more different than what TADA was, is because the UAPA has, from its start, had that lineage of anti-free speech. It is there. It's part of the law's conception. It's part of its use, although a dormant use, but it's still part of it. On top of which you sort of bootstrap this set of provisions about terrorism, which are vaguely worded. Vague, when I say vague, I mean vague to the level at which you can't even imagine vague, right? So they're vaguely worded. And there are no decisions of courts that are regulating, okay, what is the scope of these provisions. Now, why it's different? It's different because it's come at a time, obviously, when terrorism, national identity, globally are things that are very different. Correct. All countries are, again, and I can't keep stressing as to how India is not very unique, sadly, but it's not very unique. It's actually, it's part of various countries. We fall in a bracket where authoritarian regimes exist. And it's probably right to start identifying that. But the UAPA is becoming prominent at a time when this is a trend, this fear of national identity, which started, let's say, with Parliament attack for us, and obviously the World Trade Center attacks. This fear that, this nation is always at, it's always about the next attack. And I mean, you're in the US, and this is something that it's part of a lot of the public safety thinking and the national security establishment there. It's always about the next attack. And in India, that's slowly growing into the motif as well, that, it's always about preventing the next big threat. And you start seeing threats everywhere. Like everything is about a threat to the safety. So there were public demonstrations against the burning of a corpse in the Hathras gang rape incident. And journalists travel there, and there's a media scrutiny. And that becomes this plot to destabilize the government. Everything is a plot. And I'm saying that when you have that being the mindset, the primary law that's going to give effect to these fears is obviously going to become that much more used. So that's one reason. The other reason is obviously the last 25 years and the political struggle with Maoism and aggressive wars as such, guerrilla warfare that's there in various parts of the country, like the Red Corridor as such. So that's definitely there as well. But you link that with this larger feeling of threats to the national establishment, and you start seeing conspiracies. I don't know whether they'll be proven in court or not, or whether they actually exist. I'm not part of any of those briefs, right? And nor have those cases been decided. But I'm saying that it becomes legitimized in the way the national establishment thinks, right? Because this idea of fear is just so deep. It's so pervasive, and it seems as if I'm talking in abstractions, but trust me, you talk about it in terms of the US, you talk about it in terms of the UK, any country today, there is a very, very dominant trend that is built upon the idea of fear to national security, fear to local security, and that defines a lot of state responses. France, for example, right? What about that unprecedented state of emergency that just kept getting prolonged again and again and again? Because you have that idea that there is a threat to our national identity. So I'm saying that the UAPA has been very prominently used because we are living in this time, one, and B, there are real threats as well, because there is armed violence that does happen in parts of the country that is built upon the idea of, negating what is the dominant idea of the nation. And it's not very hard to link the two. So that's like the long answer on the UAPA and why it's necessary for the government to use it.
So in such a scenario, I would imagine that you have a bulwark against, government
You hit the nail on the
misuse
head there.
misuse
You
of
hit
these
the nail on the head.
provisions. And
Absolutely.
we were talking about this briefly before we got onto the podcast, but when I think about the United States, there is a strong First Amendment protector constituency called, it's called the ACLU over here, but that's not the only one, and that's not the only cause that people litigate to, preserve. So my impression is that we have a sizable legal community in India. They're very active, and it was my impression that this would be the bulwark. Like the lawyers would be the bulwark against the government coming and infringing on the rights of the individual. And I want you to dispossess me of my immature opinions right now.
So I'm gonna first just emphasize as to how you've really hit the nail on the head, because when I say that the UAPA might seem necessary, that's just one part of the political equation, right? The UAPA, however necessary it might seem, the cost can't be jailing people endlessly for year after year, especially in a law where you have more than 65% acquittals, right? So that shows you that, this is the cost that we are paying, and that's not a fair balance. It's just not fair. And again, why that happens is because of the structure of the law. It is just so you allow for arrests based on suspicions anyway, across the board, right? When you allow that to happen, even in a special law, an extraordinary law like the UAPA, which allows you to go inside for years on end, it's problem number one. You then create a legal regime where bail becomes the exception rather than the rule.
And no norm, right?
And you then basically create a situation where, although the law is telling you, hey, there's a presumption of innocence in our society, in our legal system, but you're still going to be in jail for the next foreseeable future, counted in years, not days. It's not, so that's the bargain that we've struck, and that's really, it's unacceptable, really. Now, about lawyers and about how can we fight this, or how has anyone fought this? So I think it again travels back to where can these fights happen, and those are the courts. And so there are various issues as to why that's not happened the way people who are outside the profession might think it can happen. Some reasons are very valid strategic reasons. Some reasons are not very valid. And some are frankly just very professional, and it's about ultimately you're living as part of a system in a society. So what might be the valid reasons are, if you go to a court and get a decision, right, on such as, okay, I'll challenge the UAPA's validity. You go in there, but you lose. Then what? Then you're stuck. Then not only is that law there, right? Going back to the setup, law there, yes, let's go to court to challenge it. Let's see what happens there. If you lose, then there is nothing stopping anything anymore, right? So lawyers, especially cause lawyers in India, have to be really careful about moving ahead. And this is something that you will find, if you speak to anyone. I don't do cause lawyering as such. I'm not a public interest lawyer as such. But it's such a big debate, because the way it works in India is that you have the Supreme Court that sort of stands above all other courts, and whatever the Supreme Court does, it's binding on every court, and it's binding on the entire legal system. So imagine a situation if someone runs to the Supreme Court with a botched petition intentionally, gets an order which upholds the legality of the law, because, well, the court's just going to decide what's before it. And then effectively, you sort of subverted this entire idea, got a stamp of legality where, it might not otherwise have come. Trust me, it happens. I'm not making this stuff up. And there's
sabotage. of a
Yeah.
country. Yeah.
Exactly. And the word that you find being used amongst cause lawyers is that it's called the ambush PIL. Right? You sort of run there, ambush the judiciary with the PIL, which doesn't allow for the court to really get into the meat of the issues. But it just sort of throws up this bogey, and the court's like, what's this nonsense? Get this out of me. And the court will uphold the law in the process, even without fully, realizing what's going on at times, because sabotage is the word that best describes it. So cause lawyers have to be very wary. Therefore, it's becoming more and more organized. So you will find more and more considered challenges going to the high courts, where lawyers will take their time to build up a challenge. They'll build up a brief. You'll find the right case to take forward, much like how it happens in the US. So you have test cases that you wait for, right? So having seen, I mean, we're in the year where Ruth Bader Ginsburg has passed away.
Correct.
And her documentary and her life is a great example of cause lawyering and waiting for the right cases to challenge and pick your battles.
Yeah.
So I think a big part of that is also affecting the UAPA in India, where you're really, you think that it's coming. And I would think that it's coming, especially because more indiscriminate use of such a harsh law allows for more test cases for lawyers. And I think that as we speak, there might be, that group of cause lawyers somewhere in the country who are really building that petition up with statistics, with data that shows all that's wrong with this law. But at the same time, cause lawyering is not that well organized in India. There is no real, I mean, there are organizations that in their heyday were comparable to, let's say, the ACLU. You had organizations such as the People's Union for Civil Liberties. That's still a very prominent organization in some parts of the country, but doesn't have an all India reach. You have the People's Union for Democratic Rights. Again, so there are these organizations, but as legal organizations. So they are civil liberty organizations, but their capabilities for organizing cause lawyering is maybe not at the level what it used to be. And then as lawyers itself, individual lawyers, there are costs to, taking these decisions, being these people who repeatedly fight these fights, get typecasted as, oh, you're like this public interest litigator who will just always be there.
It comes with a professional cost.
Absolutely, right? Because ultimately, you are either, there are various identities that all of us have to, make sense of. Your political beliefs, your political identities, where do they fit with your professional identity? Do you see yourself as a lawyer, right? As someone who's part of a profession, who wants to do good for himself, for his family, go ahead, get somewhere in life and have reputation or whatever, the standard professional career goals that anyone will have. So as a lawyer, it's not a bad thing to just be a professional where, you do this to earn a living. And in the process, you help people solve their disputes and you help people navigate the system. There's no shame in being that. But at the same time, obviously, if you view yourself as that kind of person, you're not going to be the person who's also, inclined to go headlong into what is going to be a messy political battle, which is any political battle.
Of course.
And these legal challenges slowly transform into political battles, especially in a situation where the government is giving you a signal that it's not afraid of picking on lawyers. So just to give you an example, there are raids that happen with prominent advocates' houses, with government agencies raiding them. There are organizations that get raided. There are lawyers that get picked up on UAPA charges. Lawyers who were defending other UAPA accused today stand accused of UAPA cases themselves. So it just becomes that much harder for, let's say, an outsider, a fresher in the legal profession, who is caught up between various, my political identity of what is it that I want to do, where, I want to fight the good fight, but at the same time, I want to, have a quote unquote a normal life where I grow up, marry, have children, grow old with them and have a decent profession to back on so that I can grow old without having to be at the mercy of a bank loan. And I'm saying that there's no shame in anywhere. it's just that slowly I feel that the willingness to fight the political fight is also increasing, which is great. The average lawyer, like myself, I don't consider myself to be an activist lawyer at all. I don't have the courage for it as I am today. But I think that the ability to speak truths to power is increasing slowly, for sure. Right? And I think overall that then itself is going to have a net gain. The more you have lawyers who would not be, willing to fight political fights as such, but they're not afraid to take up the cases where really, you just can't stand by and keep looking anymore. So the more and more briefs get taken up by lawyers who are competent, who are willing to, take up a case and really take it up and not just do it for the heck of it. But at the same time, you don't have to be someone who's a card carrying political party member. Right? So the more you find that community contributing to civil rights and civil liberties activism, they're not going to be leading it. I'm not saying that that middle category of lawyers is going to be leading the fight. But the more you find that category of lawyers willing to take on a political brief and do it justice, it's going to have a net gain on where we are. Because right now it's building there, and I think that's an unintended positive consequence of just how brazen some of the government decisions have become. That more and more people are, and more lawyers who might have, let's say, been willing to stand by and not really get into dirty work, are like, you just can't stand by and let this keep happening.
That's definitely the case, of course. And this brings me to something which is really interesting, and hopefully something that's like a closing question, if I may. Has Indians become more prickly of taking offense over time? Or do you think this has always existed? Because from your, I just ask you strictly from your practical experience, right? And how do you see this evolving? What do you see as the future of free speech in India now? What is happening?
Before you answer that, let me tag on to that, because, this is something in my mind. At the end of the day, the political system, to some degree, I don't know how well it does that, it reflects the values of your society, right? And there are deferential values in Indian society which do give undue importance to authority, and do frown upon sort of anything that's considered quote unquote deviant behavior. And in this case, this would be speaking your mind out against something which is considered the orthodoxy. So to what extent is this system just a reflection of where we are as a society and a country?
I don't. Okay, so I live in Bombay, right? Because I'm surrounded by Bollywood fans. I myself, I'm not a Bollywood fan, but when you see the evolution of Bollywood with regards to the music or the film titles, people you can see that they were taking offense in that sense also. So I'm not strictly talking about politics in general, but then Indians in general, what is happening.
I think talking at the level of generalizations has its benefits and has its limitations.
Yeah.
And so let's be very clear about that at the start. We spoke about India as a society not being very clear upon what it means to have public discourse and what it means to have discourse about public office. And I stand by that wholeheartedly. And I mean, that affects how you see the court consider people talking about it. You see that at the micro levels as well. And I'm maybe misremembering, but I remember I think it was Ramchandra Guha in a podcast that I was listening to recently. I might be wrong here, but I think the opinion that I'm remembering sort of, it sounds like he is the one who was, I can sort of hear his voice, where he was also saying exactly what Sanskriti said, that, Indians just don't seem to be very good at dealing with any form of criticism. So I think he was talking about it in context of cricket, and how he was outspoken about some public decisions that might be taken by prominent cricketers, that they shouldn't be doing something such as conflict of interest. It's a serious problem in that regard. But any first response to criticism is not introspection, it's offense.
Yes.
And I mean, I think that it's a very subjective notion definitely, I share your subjective notion, and I can just say that much. Now, whether or not what impact that might have, I think it's something that merits amazing political and sociological study to see how deep that runs. But from where I stand and what I see in terms of my profession, in terms of my, let's say, if I assume a role of, someone who's just looking at the news, looking at regional newspapers, Hindi language newspapers, English language newspapers, and the kind of political conversations that happen, the kind of normal conversations that happen every day, the first response is not introspection, it is taking offense. And the problem is, in public office, that really shouldn't be the case, right? I mean, if you're in public office demands criticism. If it demands responsibility, it equally demands criticism. And if your first reaction is offense, and your offense is, I am going to do something about it, and I'm going to use my political power to do something about it, that doesn't make for a very robust society that thrives on its criticism to do better. It becomes sort of caricatures itself into a society that goes after anyone who says anything. And I don't know which way that's going to go, but yeah, I share your subjective.
Definitely. And what I take away from this talk is the fact that what seems to be in India now a society that's tending towards liberalism, we have got a state of political parties that's more prickly than ever before. But states have also been prickly, and we've got a judiciary that is choosing cases selectively, of course, because people are making these simple issues, to be national issues. So if I'm making any sense here.
No, but what is the example that you have about simple issues and national issues?
Issues that have already been upheld by the Supreme Court before, and you're just bringing them up again, which makes no sense because you've already got a precedence and we already know what is the sense of the court.
That's not fair, right? So I wouldn't go so far. I mean, ultimately, in a system where the court is sort of functioning as something that ultimately decides disputes and decides, okay, we think that this is what the law is. Tomorrow, society's conception of that being right can change, and it can very variedly change. So I'll give you an example, and this is again going back to the constitution. We have what is called preventive detention in India, right? Totally different from our it links to free speech as well, because in some cases, people who engage in robust free speech can even be subjects of preventive detention, targets of preventive detention. And let me just very briefly tell you why is it such a big problem. Because in normal cases, you will at least go through the effort of trying to suggest, oh, this person committed a crime, and therefore I'm going to arrest them. In preventive detention, the idea is they are dangerous, and therefore I'm going to send them in jail. And that jailing happens for 3 months at a time. 3 months. Right? And normally in arrests, you have to justify an arrest to a magistrate. A magistrate will look at it, and you can file for bail. I'm saying that preventive detention is part of the constitution in a sense. How we regulate preventive detention is also part of the constitution. The court has again and again said it's fine. I'm saying today, if I was to sort of lead, let's say, a political party, on one of the planks of that political party is that all of this, including the Supreme Court's views, are incorrect, and if I come to power, I will force through a constitutional amendment to rid ourselves of this. I'm saying that that's very valid. There shouldn't be a conversation about it. And I'm saying that, again, even people who think that, okay, fine, there are some forms of religious freedom that, they are more comfortable with. And you and I might definitely disagree with those ideas of religious freedom where the police needs to give its thumbs up before two people decide to marry, and they can crash a wedding even at the end. Ultimately, I can't say that those people aren't entitled to their views, but is a state allowed to pass that into law? That's a different fight altogether.
And right? I pity those people because they're not getting damages in forms of money because, yesterday only I read about something along the lines of these two people, there was a Hindu woman and a Muslim man, they were consenting towards that marriage, right? But this police bashed into the wedding and they said that you're not marrying because you are interfaith, like interfaith marriages. So what is happening? I mean, I don't understand. And is the state really that stupid to pass a law that I mean, how can a state be so stupid?
It's not about stupid, right? A state is responding to political consensus. People have been voted into power on this plank.
Definitely.
It was part of the political plank even during the election for certain political parties.
Definitely.
But I'm going to change the conversation slightly to focus on one thing that you said there, which was about damages.
Yes.
And I think that's again essential to not only a respect for civil liberties,
Yes.
because ultimately, and this goes back to where we started, right? If you have a setup where a state is allowed to arrest you, jail you, sanction you in whatever way, without any threat of damages to itself, then what is, even if a court says, okay, fine, that law is bad, how are you really going to affect police practices? And that links to even the US, right? For instance, police brutality is an issue that is rife across the US. Now, if you look at decisions that are talking about getting damages and getting recompense for what is arbitrary police violence, right? You'll find that those are totally different things. To be able to sue the government for wrongs that I suffer, because I shouldn't be arrested for this. I shouldn't have to suffer jail and obviously the kind of aggression, oppression that comes with it. But I mean, if it's problematic in the US, it's beyond, I mean, it's not even part of the conversation here. To think of suing the state for damages and getting something. It's not even part of the conversation. And the few instances where it happens in high profile cases, which is why they really stick out in memory. So one instance being this case that came up recently, and right now it's part of an article in the Caravan in the ISRO spy scandal of 1992.
Oh, yes.
So, I mean, merits of the ISRO spy scandal aside, it's a very prominent instance of one individual taking on the system and getting damages for the agony that he suffered, right? So that's interesting. Similarly, if you go back, and Kerala is another example for this, there are horrible instances of people who got picked up during the internal emergency of 1975 to 1977, where, we know how many people got arbitrarily picked up. How many people sued the government, right? It's just not part of the conversation. And until you have accountability, not only about criticism, but also about actually giving damages. So I think that's also one direction in which cause lawyering will head, hopefully.
Yes.
And that's some direction in which people have already started doing it. But just last example on this, because it's contemporary. The news from a certain part of Tamil Nadu in July of this year about custodial violence and deaths in the case of Jayaraj and Benix. And it became national news, it became international news. But again, compensation doesn't come because you fight the government. You know what happened there was that the chief minister said, okay, I'm going to give ex gratia compensation. It's a totally different conversation. It's about the ruler saying, okay, I will give you money. Take money, be happy, my subjects. It's not about a citizen going to court and saying, you had no right to do this.
Yes.
And I ought to be compensated for what was totally unlawful action on your part. We're still on the first mode of conversation. And I think that, all those conversations about subjects and citizens, criticism, all of that's interconnected. And slowly we're definitely having more and more contestations of, are we willing to just be happy by being subjects?
I wanted
to because I asked this question with a certain individual in my mind, right? Because you see Sudha Bharajwaj spending 3 years in jail now since 2018, and you see these people spending years in jail, and after all, they will get certain sort of, like, I'm not making any assumptions, but let's just be real with ourselves. There are people who spend half a decade in jail and been acquitted. So they just lost all their life, and the government is not doing anything. And it's up to us also, right? Because if I'm spending half a decade in jail, I'm just happy to be out. I am not again wanting to challenge that authority again, because I'm scared. So I think I asked this question with a certain individual in mind, and that makes absolute sense, because we need more people to stand up, like, against these people, to be very, very
sorry, but I think Abhishek had to say something.
Yes.
So I can
I was just going to pass an observation that when I speak to people in the legal activist community, there's like code red emergency, everything like civil liberties under threat, etc., etc. And then when I speak to people of the general public, that I don't see that level of emergency. To be very honest, it's just we are just we are a group of people that are talking amongst each other in this legal secularist language, which is not percolating. And I think that to drive the conversation towards effective long-term scale, I don't think the answer comes from the judiciary. I think it comes from the society. It comes bottom up, not top down.
Yeah, absolutely. And which is why I said that, it's not, I mean, people who take decisions, even though Supreme Court or court might have said something, even like, questioning that, I fully respect that, because like you said, I don't think that the answers come from top down. And ultimately a society, your paper rights are not going to define your scope of liberties. It's about how willing you are to fight for them. And I mean, the structure of India is such that unless, and especially the middle class, I mean, unless, you see the system getting affected in a let's say, non-classist way, you're not going to see that. So and that sort of ties up into what I was going to say to Sanskriti's question. Data is really interesting on this front, right? And if you look at whatever available government data we have about law enforcement, criminal law enforcement, it is disproportionately poor, marginalized communities that have to go to prison. Usually also people who don't have more than standard 10th education. So that's sort of people who might have gone to school till age 15 and 14, actually, depends on where you are. So disproportionately, it's not only minorities in terms of religious and caste minorities who are in prison, but also people who are not well educated who go to prison. People who are moneyed don't really end up experiencing the hard end of the stick. That's one. And the second is, one thing that is concerning, and if you look at the data about, she spoke about Sudha Bhardwaj as an example of just people spending longer. People spending unimaginably, horribly long amounts of time in prison has been the case. There have been those instances. But what's worrying is that, and I'm writing a paper on this, so I've been recently reading all these reports from 1995 onwards to 2020, 2019, is that you have a trend between, let's say, 2000 to 2010, where prison numbers are not really increasing. So India does not have too many people in prison as a national figure. Okay, so let's be very clear about that. For some reason or the other, too long to discuss that. But India still has 2/3 of prisoners as people who are not convicts. They are
under trials.
They are not yet judged to be guilty of a crime. And what's interesting is that between 2000, and I don't know the reasons for this, but 2000 to 2010, not government related, but you see a pattern where slowly prison populations don't increase by that much. You actually have some years where the overall prison population decreases year on year. But underneath that, the length of time that people started spending in custody, by the end of that decade, it started increasing. And that increase has continued. So as under trials over the last 25 years or so, actually, the amount of time that on an average people spend has started to increase. So let's say if in 1995, it was around 40% of people in prison for up to 3 months. Today, that's around down to 35%. And there has been more than 2% increases in the people who are in prison for up to 1 to 2 years, up to 2 to 3 years. And, those 1 to 2% are thousands of people.
Yes.
And it is deeply worrying that more and more time is spent by people in prison as under trials, and longer time is being spent. And yes. I think that, there is something to say that people are being sent away without, it has costs, because it makes people cynical about what the law is doing, what the criminal law is doing. Because if that is what the overall perception of the law is, that people who go to prison just go to prison, it becomes de-linked from, whether they're guilty or whether they're innocent.
Yes.
And just imagine, so then, you link it back to their reputation about them getting acquitted. It just stops mattering, right? Because prison is what matters. You throw people into prison, completely separating it from whether or not the question of their guilt, whether they're guilty. I mean, you then are living in a setup where arrest and prison by themselves, no matter what the allegation is, are able to ruin your life. And that's worrying. That's worrying to the level of, it fundamentally changes what your society is like.
And I think this conversation should be a completely different episode because nobody's talking about it, even though it's such a pervasive problem in the criminal justice legal community. And I think we do need to give more emphasis to criminal justice reform in general. And Abhinav, I think you've given us so much insight. And we can keep talking and talking, but I think this is a good excuse to invite you back to talk about some of the issues that you brought up, including criminal justice reform. On that note, I think I learned a lot. It's always fun talking to lawyers because you realize how little you know your own country and what people are experiencing in within that system.
My pleasure.
Thanks so much for coming on, and I hope you come back on next in a few weeks or months.
Surely, if you invite me.